Blustery, Minnesota Day. My name is Trava Olivier. I am the museum educator here at the Pipestone County Historical Society, and today I'm also your guest presenter. So my topic today is on a diphtheria epidemic that happened in the county, really in a larger region as we look at some of the newspaper clippings that I have back in 1883. And I have to, full confession of what intrigued me about this topic or why this topic. I have to give credit where credit's due. Mary Ann DeGroot, the county recorder from that was here for a number of years, had told us about a story of a family, and I'm going to talk about them today, and I'll get into it, but it was really her story of one particular family, and I knew the children's deaths in that family were from diphtheria, that made me go, childhood death was very common early. We didn't have modern medicine, and I wondered. And so a little trip down to our county recorder's office and a look at the official causes of death that are listed on the death record led me to this presentation for today. So in order to talk about diphtheria, I'm going to give you some information about the disease, first of all, and I'm going to start by telling you some of the names that diphtheria went by. Heart distemper, Syrian ulcer, membranous croup, Boulogne sore throat, kiss of death, strangling angel disease, and finally the name diphtheria. Those words were all used interchangeably across the globe. This was a disease that occurred for centuries. The first known or recorded cases of the disease in world history dates to Spain in 1613. And the Spanish have a name for that year. And translated into English, it's called the Year of Strangulations because of the number of deaths that occurred in Spain that year. So for the next 300 years, it left its mark all over the globe in lots of countries, including the United States. Diphtheria is known to strike children more than adults. About 20 to 25% of those who contracted the disease died from it. Symptoms usually appeared about 2 to 5 days after exposure, although they could happen anywhere from 1 to 10 days after exposure to the disease. The infected person would develop a fever that would be greater than 100.4 degrees. They'd then develop a sore throat and swollen glands in their neck. As the disease progressed or took hold, the sufferer would have difficulty in swallowing. A red rash would appear on the skin. And as the disease continued to progress, bacteria would grow and coat the throat and multiply. These were clusters of thick membranous type of cysts that had a white or gray appearance, and it often blocked the airway and led to asphyxiation, which is why it was called the strangling angel disease. Kiss of death was because mothers might be carrying it and they would kiss their child, an innocent mother-to-child kiss that would lead to the child developing the disease. Before 1826, all those different names I mentioned were used all over the world. It was in 1826 that a French scientist by the name of Pierre Bretonneau gave the word diphtheria to the disease. And it was after a Greek word that meant leather, because those membranes took on a leather-like appearance in the throat. When identifying the disease by common names that I've listed, helped us to know more about the disease we're dealing with. They all were the same disease. It certainly did nothing to stop the spread or understand how to prevent it. In 1883, the year I'm going to talk about in our county, the single bacteria that caused diphtheria was identified, which was a sign of progress. It led to further development, but at that time, it still didn't tell us how to prevent it. We could look under a microscope and know that, yes, that's what we're dealing with, but we didn't know how to cure it or how to prevent it. So I say that we have this sign of progress, and that sign of progress or this misunderstanding or lack of knowledge about what that identification meant shows up in our local county newspapers. The Pipestone County Star on November 8th of 1883 said, "There has never been so much sickness among children in Pipestone County as there is at the present time. Parents cannot be too careful of the little ones during the changeable fall weather. An ounce of prevention in the way of good warm clothing is worth many pounds of a doctor's cure. Don't forget this. Does that sound familiar to any of you out there? Even growing up, I can remember my grandma saying, put on a hat or wear your coat. If you don't, if you go outside and it's cold or with wet hair, you're going to get sick. And that was a belief system before we came to understand that bacteria can be cured with antibiotics or viruses are going to happen regardless of the climate. Pipestone County Star from December 6 reported, some physicians ascribe the prevalence of diphtheria at the present day largely to badly trimmed smoky kerosene lamps. While left burning in the chambers all night, turned down low, filling the room with their poisonous fumes in connection with a fetid atmosphere of ill-vented apartments. So there you go. According to what was being printed in the local paper, which we can assume is being printed across the nation, coming from medical professionals, that, it's your own fault, parents. Don't leave the kerosene lamp burning or trim those wicks better. That's just a sign of how ill understood the disease was. And one of my favorites from December 20th of 1883, diphtheria can be carried from house to house by chickens, according to a German physician. Now remember, 1883, our towns, the few that we have, are hardly developed, and free-range chickens in your backyard was just your source of eggs. It wasn't like from farm to farm. When they say house to house, that could be within the community boundaries itself. So why was our local newspaper running information on diphtheria that speculated really on how it spread or how we could prevent it? Perhaps it was because Pipestone County was experiencing what I would call an epidemic that year of the disease. An epidemic is defined by an outbreak of a disease that spreads quickly and affects many individuals at the same time, straight out of the dictionary. Many individuals in a specific geographic area. In checking recorded deaths at the Pipestone County Recorder's Office, diphtheria was listed as the cause of death in 0 of the 19 recorded deaths in 1881, 0 of 12 recorded deaths in 1882. But in 1883, the number increased. It actually was the cause of death listed in 11 of 33 deaths. 33% of the deaths that were recorded that year were from diphtheria. It then fell the next year to 1 out of 33, and the following year to 2 out of 36. And that's why I call it an epidemic, because it was a sudden rise of cases within the county. It seems logical to conclude that. So the Pipestone County Star made the following statement on September 6th. The physicians inform us that there is very little sickness of a serious nature in the county at present. The county is entirely too healthy for doctors and too peaceable for lawyers. The doctors are waiting for the changing fall weather to come in and the lawyers for the after-harvest fights to open. Pretty broad statement, right? And whether that's an accurate representation of what the newspaper editor believed to be true, or if it was an attempt to bolster public confidence, can't be known. I do know from researching some smallpox epidemics in the 1900 to 1903 era, the editors did print papers to bolster, or editorials, the confidence. This was a fledgling county with fledgling communities. If people feared an epidemic, they would keep to themselves. Not good when you're trying to encourage settlement in the county. In 1883, we were a small county. The only communities that existed in 1883 in Pipestone County were the community of Pipestone, which had been platted in 1876, Woodstock, Airlie, and Edgerton that were platted in 1879, and Hatfield had been platted in 1880. None of the other communities existed at that time. The census record for 1880 for the county was just under 2,000 people, about a fifth of today's population. So perhaps they were trying to bolster public confidence. Perhaps they believed what they were printing. Regardless of what the editor did or didn't know, in the same issue of the Pipestone County Star, we read this: 2 bright little children have been plucked from the hearthstone of Mr. M.C. O'Mahony near Woodstock during the past week by that dread disease diphtheria. And still worse, a 3rd child at this writing lies very near the point of death from the same malady. The next week, the newspaper shifted slightly to report the following. Diphtheria is reported as spreading in many towns of the state, slaughtering the little ones in large numbers. The greatest preventative of this disease is cleanliness, and those who wish to avoid a visitation should see that everything about their premises is put in good order. We are as apt to have diphtheria here as anywhere. An ounce of prevention is worth 10 pounds of cure. The editor seems to acknowledge that diphtheria is spreading, although they hedge their bets and don't really say it's in Pipestone County, do they? They say it's apt to be here. So it does acknowledge some things, but again, in the same edition where they're hedging their bets a little bit, we read, the little child of Mr. M.C. O'Mahony near Woodstock that was mentioned last week in the Star as lying very low of diphtheria died on Friday last. This is the third death in the family inside of 2 weeks, all of diphtheria. Their ages being 3, 6, and 8 years. There is one girl left aged 14 years, but she is so prostrate with grief over the death of the little ones that the physicians fear she cannot live. This is a terrible affliction indeed, and the heartfelt sympathy of our people will go out to Mr. O'Mahony and his wife, who have borne up heroically under this fearful trial. The very next paragraph reads, later. Since the above was in type, the little girl died, and it is now feared the mother cannot survive the shock. That's 4 children in one family. If you were to visit the Pipestone County Recorder's office, and view the death records, you would learn the names of those children. 6-year-old William O'Mahony died September 2nd. 3-year-old Bridget died on September 3rd. 11-month-old Matthew died September 5th. And 14-year-old Minnie passed away on September 8th. 4 children in 6 days. Now, the official cause of death, and this is where Mary Ann de Groot comes in, as I said, for the first 3 on the county record is diphtheria. Minnie, the 14-year-old's death, is listed on the official record as a broken heart. I would argue that her cause of death was diphtheria. It was clearly in the family home. The family buried their children on the corner of the family farm, and then they moved into Woodstock, and they donated that piece of land to the Catholic Church, and it became what is St. Martin's Catholic Cemetery today. They have the large stone that you see, and on the north-facing side of the stone are the names of the 2 sons, and on the south-facing side are the names of the 2 daughters. Those were the first 4 cases out of the 11 that were recorded to strike the county. Now, perhaps the loss of 4 children in under a week prompted the newspaper editor to take a bit more of a stance on the disease, at least in its recommendation of what you should do. Because in the same paper as we read about the deaths and the aptness for it to be in Pipestone County, they also printed, the newspapers are doing the public health a damage in printing so-called specifics for the care of diphtheria. There is no infallible cure. And while some of the remedies are useful in a general way until the physician arrives, yet those who love their friends will not delay a moment in summoning the skilled assistance of a physician when a case of diphtheria is in the house. In reading microfilm of the local newspapers through the remainder of September and into October, it seems that the cases of diphtheria were contained to that one household. I was unable to find anything else in the newspaper in September or October about diphtheria, and there were no deaths recorded at the county recorder's office in the rest of those months. But then, as suddenly as it seemed to not be a thing, on November 8th, it becomes a thing again in the local paper. Mr. and Mrs. John Wingle near Woodstock mourn the loss of their little 3-year-old daughter who died of diphtheria yesterday. A little daughter of Mr. and Mrs. W.H. Dickey of Gray Township died last Thursday, aged 2 years and 6 months. In checking the death records of these 2 children at the county, the newspaper information was confirmed. Emma Dickey died on November 3rd and Mary Wingle on November 6th. Emma is buried at Old Woodlawn Cemetery in Pipestone. Mary was buried near the O'Mahony children in what became St. Martin's Cemetery. And the county recorder's official cause of death for both those girls was diphtheria. Amidst the tragic stories, there were scattered stories of good news. When we look at the same issue, November 8th, we read about Gracie, a little daughter of C.C. Goodnow, has been quite seriously ill the past few days. In checking census records for 1885, Gracie was alive and well in the family home, so she recovered from her malady. Census records tell us lots of things that help us to know sometimes when we can't find official recorded records. From the Pipestone County Star on November 22nd, we read, reports show that the little flurry of sickness throughout the county is rapidly decreasing. Again, an editorial. Is it based on what's happening, or is it based on the attempt to bolster public confidence? We've talked about 6 of the 11 cases. On Pipestone County Star, December 6th, the Raymore girls have been sick the past week with diphtheria, but are on the gain now. So some of the good news that's scattered in. But for every good report, you could find in the same issues of those newspapers reports that contradicted what they were saying. Percy and Willie, little sons of Mr. and Mrs. Aust of Rock Township, aged 5 and 11 years, died during the past week of that dreadful scourge diphtheria. Will was only ill 3 days. 5 more are down with diphtheria in the same family, but as of this writing are on a fair way to recovery. The official county record indicate that Rudolph Percy Aust died November 10th and William Aust died on November 14th, both from diphtheria. Sadly, it is unknown where these children are buried, as information cannot be located. And what I would say to that is, we're in the very earliest history of our county. A lot of communities aren't established. A lot of churches have not been established at this time, so a lot of cemeteries have not been established. It was also, if the death was attended by a physician, the physician made sure it got recorded at the county recorder's office. If it happened at home without a physician present, it became the family's responsibility to report the death to the the township clerk or a township official, who then were tasked to report it to the county recorder's office. We're in the very earliest time of the history. There weren't always the proper places to record it. Some of those records maybe did not travel. We didn't have a county courthouse. We didn't have some of the facilities where records were kept. I also know that Pipestone's first cemetery, started in 1879, was located in the 8th Avenue Southwest Highway 30 area, the Dar's Pizza area of Pipestone. In 1882, land was donated for what became Woodlawn, or we call it Old Woodlawn Cemetery. Some of those burials were removed when they started developing that township. Not all of them were marked graves, not all of them were recorded. There is the area at Old Woodlawn that is known as Potter's Field that the city does not know who is buried there. It is possible they are in one of our cemeteries and the records just don't reflect their burial there. It's possible they were buried on family land. It is hard to know the answer to that question. As we continue reading, on December 6th, died in this village on Friday evening, November 30th, 1883, William Edward, the son of Mr. and Mrs. Frank Poorbaugh, aged 5 years, 3 months, and 9 days. Willie died of membranous croup. This disease ran a very rapid course, the little fellow only being sick a few days. Now, if you remember when I started, membranous croup was one of those names for diphtheria. And again, if you go and look at the county record, it is listed officially as diphtheria. William Poorbaugh is buried in Old Woodlawn Cemetery, though it is in an unmarked grave. And on December 13th, died William Wallace, son of Mr. and Mrs. Anson Pike, aged 8 years and 10 months, died at the residence of his parents in Grange Township last Monday after a brief illness of 2 days. The little fellow was exceptionally bright and smart, and his sudden death is a hard blow to his parents and friends. So while the newspaper doesn't state diphtheria in this case, the cause of death recorded with the county recorder does. Willie is also buried in Old Woodlawn Cemetery. So that's 10 of the 11 deaths that I mentioned. There were 11. The final death recorded officially as diphtheria was in 1883, was of a young man, really, a 20-year-old, Abraham Kronk. No newspaper accounts were recorded that I could find that located his death anywhere. No burial information could be found. What we do know is from the county recorder's office that he was one of the ones listed on the official death register for Pipestone County as being from diphtheria. Using census records, I know he was born in 1864 in Wisconsin to Ilias and Eliza Jane Kronk, and that the family lived in Rock Township in Pipestone County, Minnesota. in 1880 census, and presumably in 1883 at the time of his death, since his death was recorded in Pipestone County. Now, those are the official deaths that were recorded due to diphtheria in the county records, but I can make a case that there were more than the 13. Of those 33 deaths I mentioned that happened in that year that got recorded at the county recorder's office, another 11, besides the 11 diphtheria cases, were deaths of children. The causes listed on the county recorder's listing is 1 by drowning, 1 by smothering in bed, 3 from scarlet fever, 1 from a deformity, 1 to tuberculosis, 1 to pneumonia, 1 to rheumatic fever, and 2 were to unknown causes. But there is one on that list of 11 other children, Ruth Whaley, whose death is listed as membranous croup. It's not listed as diphtheria, but we've already established that the two were used interchangeably, so that would make her the 12th in the county from the disease. Ruth was born April 1st of 1882 and died December of 1883 at the age of 20 months, and it is also unknown where she is buried. There is also a death of young Nina Rudder. She was 17. She's not listed in the county death record at all, but I did find her in our newspaper. Now, I've already mentioned that it was the physician's job to record it or the family's job to report it. So why it's not on the county death record? Some type of error must have occurred. That being said, if we read her case, it says, died in this village on Sunday, November 4th, 1883, Nina E. Rudder, age 17 years, 5 months, and 17 days. Miss Rudder's illness was caused by a disease of the lungs, which she has been before affected, but this time it ran a rapid and fatal course in 1 short week. The young lady has only been a resident of Pipestone a few months, but during this time she made many acquaintances who regret her sudden death. That account doesn't seem to indicate diphtheria at all, does it? It indicates a lung disease. So while I can't be sure, I'm going to make the following case. 2 weeks later, November 22nd, 1883, a young son of Mr. Rudder, the furniture dealer, has been quite low with diphtheria for the past week. In checking Nina's name and census records, she was a member of this same family. Diphtheria was clearly in their household, and perhaps she did have some type of a lung disease that she had experienced in the past. But it's possible to make a case and plausible that if she contracted diphtheria that was clearly in the family home, it could have been a complication that they attributed to a disease she had already had rather than listing it as diphtheria. So we can't know for sure if she contracted diphtheria. I would make a case that it's very plausible that she did. Diphtheria continued to wreak havoc on many communities for the next several decades. These are by no means all the cases that happened in the county, and probably not all the cases that happened that year. Those were the ones we could find through county records and through newspaper reports. There were plenty of settlers living out on homesteads outside of Pipestone City or one of the established communities with newspapers where the information may never have made it to a recorder's office or to a newspaper. Medical advances eventually led to antitoxins and vaccinations that took time to perfect. By the early 1940s, widespread vaccination led to what became the virtual elimination of the disease here in the United States. The last case reported in the United States occurred in 2003, and it was contracted by somebody that was traveling that wasn't completely or fully vaccinated. Worldwide, countries still struggle with diphtheria. There were more than 10,000 cases reported to the World Health Organization in 2023, most of them being in African countries. And as of the end of February of this year, the World Health Organization had level 2 travel warnings issued to several countries in Africa, including Nigeria, where over 800 deaths from diphtheria were recorded in the first 2 months of 2024. In the United States, most of us vaccinate our children, and they received the DTP vaccine, diphtheria, pertussis, tetanus. It is recommended that we get a booster every 10 years. And even as adults, you're probably getting a booster because if you're getting a tetanus shot, you're getting a DTP or a TP, but they are including diphtheria in with your tetanus just to make sure. That being said, if you were going to travel outside of the United States, there are usually regimens and protocols that doctors prescribe for updates on vaccinations to prevent the disease. So, well, we've, in our country, have made a lot of progress from a time when it took the lives of many children with understanding modern medicine and prescribing vaccination regimens for our children. It continues to be a disease that can affect children across the world, and it continues to affect them in the same way as I described. It is the fever, it is the cysts, it is the strangling angel disease because of the way it progresses. So, questions, comments?
Why was it so common among children and not adults?
That's a great question. I don't have an answer for you. Some diseases just do seem to be more childhood diseases. Diphtheria was one of them. If you contracted it once and survived, which arguably 75 to 80% of the people who contracted it did, you develop that natural immunity, much like, people who have had chicken pox and so on before we had vaccinations for those. So probably by adulthood, many of the adults had already had developed a natural immunity. Yes?
I learned the other day that smallpox, there's a cemetery out on Ed Lowell's land by the, you know what?
I know which cemetery you're talking about. Prairie Lawn. Many people call it Pox, but it is Prairie Lawn or Troy Cemetery. And what I can tell you about that is around 1980, a lady by the name of Janice North looked at the burials that were there, the names, and through obituaries and county records, there is no one buried at that cemetery that died from smallpox. There is a rumor that, that's where they buried people who had it because it was so contagious. It is somewhat thought that perhaps it got that nickname to try to discourage because it's in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of a section. It was known as a destination for teenagers to maybe gather, maybe some partying, alcohol type of things, and it was a way to try to discourage those types of activities in the cemetery. But we do know that nobody that is buried there died from smallpox. That I can say. Why it got that name is the stories we've heard. I can't say that definitely.
I read through the whole book of obituaries a second time, and there is no smallpox, but there is 6 from diphtheria.
And I will believe that, yes. Pearl has a fondness to that cemetery, and she stated, for any of you who didn't hear, and those of you that are watching us later on a recorded video, that she has read through the burial book related to the Prairie Lawn Cemetery, and there are no smallpox, but there are 6 from diphtheria. And that was over, not all in 1883, I focused on 1 year. That was over the early history of the county.
Into 1889 and so
Up to 1889 or so? Okay. Yes, and like I said, I may not have found every case in 1883. I found what was recorded in the papers that I have access to, which is Pipestone. Jasper didn't have a town or a newspaper then, so when you get down to that end of the county, they could have had diphtheria and it maybe never got recorded to the proper places. And then I also would argue that, Jasper sits right on a county line. And so as such, perhaps there were deaths that we might consider local people. And I find that with lots of things, burials in the Jasper Cemetery or the St. Joseph Cemetery, where they really were from Rosedale Township in Rock County, but they affiliated with, did business, went to church in the Pipestone County side, and that's where they are buried. So there could have been deaths along that border that were recorded in Rock County as well. Well, if there's no other questions, thank you all for coming out and listening this morning. I know it was I have a tendency to do dark, deep topics, but one of the things we do every summer since COVID is cemetery tours, and we will be doing them again this summer, the second Saturday of June, July, August, and September. I will be at, let's see, St. Joseph's Cemetery in June. I will be at Peace Lutheran up by Ruthton in July, and that will be a veterans tour. So we honor the military service of veterans at that one. In August, we will be at Prairie Lawn Cemetery. And then we are going, we have been to almost every cemetery in the county, so we are going there in August. The county is aware that we're going to be doing a tour. It is an abandoned cemetery by state standards, meaning there's no church or cemetery association responsible for it. And so when that happens by state law, it's county responsibility. And people often wonder what that looks like, and I can't even tell you define responsibility. I know they mow it, but people will come to us and say, well, there's broken stones. Yes, there probably are, but did you know the family purchases the stone and the family purchases the plot? So whose responsibility really is it? And if there's no family around, then maybe nobody's taking responsibility. But, we can't blame. I don't understand the laws well enough to say we need to lay blame anywhere. We're going to go, with that one, it's a biography tour. So we're going to talk about the life stories of some of those earliest pioneers that are buried there. And then the last one we're going to be at, and these are all by permission, I will say, we will be at St. Leo's Cemetery in September, and that will be a symbolism tour. So that's where we talk about the old headstones and what does an urn or a cross or a dove, what are those supposed to mean? Because those types of old stones, those oldest stones, come from an era of like Victorian society when a lot of people couldn't read, and so the details on the stone were meant to tell the story of the person's life. So that's where we'll be at this summer. So yes, we get to go to Prairie Lawn. Hope to see you there. All right, well, thanks for coming out, everybody.